Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Here's an interesting and potentially significant story. A group of about 60 Asian organizations is suing Harvard University. They say that affirmative action hurts Asian students, and they have the numbers to prove it. According to a study by Princeton University, Asian applicants must score 140 points higher on the SAT than white students do, 270 points higher than black students do, and 450 points higher than African American students just to have the same shot at getting in. Is that fair? Joining us now is someone who thinks it is fair. Chen is a Harvard alum who supports affirmative action. He's part of a group that is fighting the lawsuit we just mentioned, and he joins us now live. Jay, thanks a lot for coming on. So my question is really simple. What would you say, and if you're a father, you may be in this position someday, what would you say to a kid applying to Harvard or any other elite school in the United States who doesn't get in because he is held to different and higher standards because of his skin color, and says to you, that's unfair, because of course it is? What would your response be?
Well, Tucker, I am a father, so this is a discussion about college admissions that I will have. But what I'll say is that, you know, the elite institutions, the acceptance rates are already so low. When I applied to Harvard, it was a 10% acceptance rate. Today, it's 5%. Right. And all of these schools, they take a holistic view. And race is never going to be the determining factor, whether or not you are going to get in. There are so many other aspects that they look at. And furthermore, I would let my son know that we don't live in a colorblind society. You can't ignore centuries of discrimination, of racism, slavery, policies like the internment of Japanese Americans and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and expect that everyone's starting off at an equal spot in the race. So racism is still here, and this last election is demonstrative of that, where it was probably the most racially divisive election that ever occurred, and the president-elect was elected despite or maybe because of some racist rhetoric, and that trickles right down to our schools.
I'm sorry. Let me just ask. You haven't answered the question, which is, if you're against racism and racial discrimination, why are you explicitly supporting a system that penalizes people for the color of their skin, which you are? How can you say you're against racism and still penalize people because they're the wrong race?
Well, Tucker, the students who apply are not being penalized because of their race. The application process is entirely holistic. They look at a lot of different things. They look at test scores, but test scores aren't the one and only thing that matter in terms of college applications. They look at leadership. They look at extracurricular activities. So race is but one factor among many that are considered.
Sure.
And I would also say that there are other advantages that come to, let's say, the white community. And there are other advantages that are conferred. For example, you know, Harvard accepts 35% of Harvard's student body, they come from private schools, while only 10% of American students go to private schools. You can look at Harvard's admittance of Northeastern students, which comprise 40% of Harvard's population, but only 17% of America lives in the Northeast. And these are all advantages that, you know, white students will also benefit from.
No, but those are all non sequiturs, actually.
Well,
hold on, wait, no, I'm sorry. As a Harvard graduate, you recognize a non sequitur when you hear one. I mean, I wouldn't defend any of those things. I'm not here to advocate for them. You're here to advocate for discriminating on the basis of race. I'm not saying race is the only criterion taken into account by Harvard's admissions, but you can't tell me that a kid who has to score 540 points higher just because of his race, over which he has no control, it's an immutable characteristic, is not being discriminated against. And again, why is that fair?
Well, I think race adds a lot to a person's life experience. I think, you know, a student at my community college, Mount SAC, who has to worry about whether or not his parents are going to be deported because they came from Mexico, has a significantly different experience than a white student who doesn't have those worries. African-American student who has to worry about whether or not he's going to be shot by a police officer for, you know, wearing a hoodie or something else. You know, these are experiences that are deeply ingrained with race that not everyone has to experience. And it impacts them negatively.
But Asian American students are disproportionately poorer, disproportionately likely to come from public schools, disproportionately immigrants, the marginalized communities you say you speak for, and yet 540-point deficit penalty on the SAT? I mean, you're punishing the weakest, actually.
Well, actually, affirmative action benefits Asian American students. I know many graduates of Harvard who say that they are beneficiaries of affirmative action. And in fact, within the Asian American rubric, you raise a very good point. we have Hmong, Laotian, we have Pacific Islanders who regularly come from communities that are far more impoverished than even Latino or African American communities, and affirmative action actually will help them. So affirmative action does benefit Asian American communities because it recognizes that the Asian American experience is not all the same.
Okay, but that's all gobbledygook. When it comes right down to it, Harvard has a quota system for Asians, and you'll deny it because it's unconstitutional, it's illegal, but it's really clear that they do. For all races, they have, for example, last year, 11.8% of their applicants were African American, 11.8% were Hispanic. That number has remained the same. It's about 20% Asian. That has remained roughly the same over 20 years as the population of college-age Asian applicants has doubled. So there's no argument, no reasonable argument against the fact that they have a quota system as they did against Jews in the 20s. And you're defending that.
Well,
Why?
Tucker, they don't have a quota system. First of all, it is unconstitutional. But secondly, when I was at Harvard, the percentage of Asian Americans was about 16 to 17%. Today it's 21%. So it's actually increased by 30% just since the time that I graduated. So it can't possibly be a quota system unless the quota numbers are changing, and then it can't be a quota system.
Unless the applicant pool has doubled, which it has. It's doubled. And that number has not doubled, as you know. And by the way, the numbers for other racial groups have remained constant because there is a quota system. Everybody's aware of it. Let me read you a quote from a man who does this for a living. His name is Brian Taylor. He runs a business that helps Asian students get into elite colleges. He said this to the Boston Globe last year. He said, "We will make them, the Asian applicants, appear less Asian when they apply." Now, why would he do that? He does that because colleges don't want too many Asians. And you know this really well. And yet you're defending it. I don't understand that at all. They're discriminating against Asians. They're open about it. Everybody knows it. And yet that's okay because why?
Well, like I said, you know, there isn't a quota system because the numbers have actually increased. And I believe they've actually increased for
not proportional
Latino
to the increase in applications.
As well.
No, actually
you're
haven't.
Right about that. But, you know, Tucker, that is a whole other segment worth exploring about this arms race of parents trying to get their kids into schools and applying to far more colleges now than they did before. So the population has not doubled, but the number of applications that are being sent out has. And colleges like this because it boosts their numbers, makes them seem more selective.
That's actually, let me correct you there. The population has grown dramatically, and when you add the international applicants, it's not just people pushing Harvard on the Common App. It's people who are qualified to go to Harvard with 800 SAT scores and straight A's and head of student council who are not getting in because of their race. Now, I mean, you haven't addressed this, though. If college counselors are counseling their students to pretend they're not Asian, and they do this for a living, they have no incentive to lie about it, you've got discrimination going on. And you're pretending it's not there for some weird ideological reason. And what is that weird ideological reason exactly? Because racism has taken place in America in years past?
You know, I think these are anecdotal. I certainly put down that I was Asian when I applied to Harvard. I got in. As a Harvard admissions interviewer, most of the students that I've interviewed who have gotten in have been Asian. So, you know, from my own personal experience, I haven't seen that. But I think the reason why some people might do that is because there is so much divisiveness where people are being told that, okay, if you are Asian, you're being discriminated against, and there are consultants who will make money off of, you know, the desire of parents to give their children the best opportunity to get into college. And,
it's the parents'
and maybe they believe that will heighten their chances. But I don't think it will.
Because when Princeton University, in a study that I think we both accept is real, says that you need to score 540 points higher than other students in order to have the same chance of getting in, I think it's a rational conclusion to believe that there's discrimination going on. Let me ask you one last question. You noted a bunch of painful periods of American history. Both of us abhor them. So the Japanese internment, slavery, Jim Crow, we all agree those were bad. Why are they bad? They're bad because they're examples of people in power hurting American citizens based on their race. How is that different from what Harvard is doing?
Well, Tucker, a lot of people will say that affirmative action in which African American and Latino students who are given admission over Asian students who have higher scores, they say that that's reverse discrimination. So then what do we say about the 60% of white students at Harvard who also are getting into Harvard despite having significantly lower scores than Asians?
That's bad.
You know,
I mean, I'm not here to defend that. I believe in the meritocracy. I asked you a simple question. Is it okay to discriminate against people on the basis of their race?
So why are we focusing on the 22% versus the 60%?
Well, because the numbers are so... I'll tell you exactly why. Because it is the hardest position to be in as an Asian student of all categories. If you are an Asian girl, it's harder to get into these colleges than if you're anyone else. And so we're picking the worst example. I could pick many examples, but my question remains the same, which is it okay to discriminate on the basis of race? I was raised to believe it's not. You apparently think it is. Is it?
No, I think that we have to recognize that we don't live in a vacuum and that racial discrimination still exists, and that we have to account for the fact that some people have a head start. And if you're going to advocate for a race-neutral policy, you're basically reinforcing the head start that some people already have.
Wait,
and
so you're saying
action is imperfect, but you know it's needed. It's part of the solution.
Is it racial discrimination to not let somebody into college based on his race? Can we just agree on that? Is it?
If that is the sole criteria that someone is not admitted into a college, then there would be something wrong with that, but that's just not the way that colleges work. They are not admitting students based solely on race. There are other factors that are involved. And, you know, I've talked about a lot of others that have benefited people, such as legacies, such as whether or not you went to a private school, if you're from the Northeast, and there are a lot of advantages.
Those are non sequiturs. I mean, you're diverting from the question. And it's just, and you know that you don't have an answer to this. But if racial discrimination is wrong, and I believe it is, then it's just wrong. I mean, there's a moral element here, I think, right?
I agree that racial discrimination is wrong, but to say that you're starting off from a clean slate as an applicant when, you know, if you are a Mexican-American student and you're worried that your parents might get deported by the next president, you know, you have a significantly different experience than
you know what?
a Caucasian
Can I just say something really clear?
That.
Children are not responsible for the sins of previous ages, okay? No 18-year-old Asian or black or Hispanic kid is responsible for slavery or Jim Crow or the sins of America. I'm sorry. And to punish them for those things is grotesque. You would agree with that, right?
I would agree with that, but then why do bad things seem to happen disproportionately to these races that were subjected to racism in the past? You want to say that racism doesn't exist, but
well, of course I'm not.
The Black Lives
saying
Matter
that you're
movement
committing racism is what I'm saying.
Is because, you know, African Americans are being, you know, killed, even if they're not armed. I mean, this is something that's happening.
I wouldn't disagree with you. I'm just
saying
saying the answer is not more racism. I guess that's the point. This may be going in circles. Jay, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tucker.